So it's a good idea at this point to just step back a little bit and reflect on the structure of the argument. So what we just did was we told this little story about Alice, and we extracted three claims from the story. The first claim that we extracted was that our subject, Alice, knows some proposition which we'll call an ordinary proposition. We also noticed that she knows that there is a connection between this ordinary proposition about going on safari and the lottery proposition about whether she's going to win a particular lottery. She knows that if the ordinary proposition holds, then the lottery proposition must hold as well. Because remember, she knows that if she's going to go on safari, then it must have been that she won the lottery. She wouldn't be able to go on safari without winning the lottery. And then finally, we know that she doesn't know the lottery proposition, or at least that's the judgment that we have in the case, that she doesn't know the lottery proposition. And by now, we're easily able to look at an argument like this and see that it's in direct conflict with the closure principle that we've been talking about for a few weeks. So what we've done is we've extracted this general skeleton of an argument, that there's an inconsistency in this very ordinary kind of case that we've described. In addition to helping us see the structure of the argument in our original case, there's also a further advantage to drawing out the skeleton of the argument like this, because it also helps us see how you can generalize lottery arguments to cover other kinds of ordinary propositions. Let's first reflect on what we might take a lottery proposition to be. I've introduced this contrast, this intuitive contrast between ordinary propositions and lottery propositions, but can we say more about what they amount to? Well, ordinary propositions are going to be the same kinds of things as we saw before, so let's focus on what lottery propositions are. As we'll understand it, now this isn't necessarily sufficient conditions, but our intuitive understanding of a lottery proposition is that it's going to be something that's inherently chancy. So that's the reason why we focused on an actual lottery in the first place, is that in whatever sense chance can exist, lotteries are chancy events. The outcome is not preordained, it's a matter of chance what happens. But of course there are lots of other things that are chancy that don't involve lotteries. For instance, there might be just a certain chance that I might have heart failure in the next few minutes. After all, there are a certain number of people who in the next few minutes are going to suffer from heart failure. And it looks like there's a hopefully very small one, but some chance that I might be one of them. Or for instance, if you're walking to school one day, there's a chance, it's a chancy matter in some ways whether you'll get there. After all, a certain number of pedestrians are killed every year on the roads, and unfortunately there is a small chance that you might be one of them. All sorts of things are chancy, even if they're not explicitly about lotteries. For that reason, we're going to class them too as lottery propositions. So things like, I'm not going to have a heart failure in the next 5 minutes, or I'm going to safely get to school this morning. These can be lottery propositions as well, because when you think about it, their truth or falsity inherently involves some, maybe small, but some level of chance. Once you start to see that the notion of a lottery proposition is more general, then you can start to see how to make this argument more general as well. So for instance, an ordinary proposition might be something like, I'm going to go out to dinner tonight. So I had dinner plans with my wife. I might think that I know I'm going to go to dinner with my wife tonight. But of course, I'm not going to be going to dinner with my wife tonight if I have heart failure in the next 5 minutes. That's just, unfortunately, something that would not happen. And here we can see we've got another kind of lottery case on our hands. On the one hand, I might take myself to know that I'm going to dinner with my wife tonight. I certainly know that if I have heart failure in the next few minutes, I won't be going to dinner with my wife tonight. Or if I go to dinner with my wife, that must mean I didn't have heart failure earlier on today. But it seems to be a chancy matter whether or not I'll have heart failure. And so we might again want to say, I don't know that I'm not going to have heart failure. Now, it's very likely that I won't, but I don't know it because there's some chance. That's just one example. We can construct another example using the walking to school example. You might think, I know I'm going to be going to a certain class at a certain time today. I know I have this class. I know I'm going to be at this class. But of course, you know that if you make it to your class, that must mean you weren't hit by a car on the way to school this morning. But again, we saw it's a chancy matter in some sense, whether you're going to get hit by a car on your way to school. So yet again, we've got another lottery puzzle. So basically, we've got a recipe for constructing these cases. We can focus on some sort of chancy proposition, something that seems to involve some level of chance, and for which reason we'll want to say that we don't know it. And then it's often easy enough to connect that, or to see that there is a connection between that and ordinary things that we take ourselves to know. So the puzzle that we're interested in goes far beyond this slightly artificial case about Alice and the safari. Lottery arguments, just like normal skeptical arguments, threaten our knowledge of ordinary things that we take to ourselves to know and that we take to be central in planning and how our life goes. Before I go on, I want to contrast a little bit further this lottery argument that we just seen from the skeptical arguments that we've been seeing so far, in particular the argument from ignorance. Because we should ask ourselves, well, what is the difference between the lottery paradox and the argument from ignorance? After all, they look really, really similar. There's a closure principle involved in both of them. In both cases, you start with a judgment that you know some ordinary thing, and we see that it conflicts with a judgment that we don't know some other kind of thing. In the argument from ignorance, the other thing was a heavyweight proposition. In the lottery argument, this time, it's instead a lottery proposition. So what is the difference between the arguments if the structure of them is so similar? Well, there are some ways in which the lottery argument is weaker than the argument from ignorance, and there are other ways in which it seems slightly stronger. So let's start with the way that might at first seem weaker. So it's not completely obvious that for absolutely every ordinary proposition we'll be able to find a corresponding lottery proposition. So for instance, if we focus on the proposition that I am standing in my house right now, it's unlikely that's the kind of thing that we can construct a lottery argument for, because it's hard to see exactly, well, what would be the corresponding chancy proposition there that would threaten my knowledge of the fact that I'm standing here right now. On the other hand, we know it's very easy to construct an argument from ignorance that threatens that ordinary proposition. Just consider any scenario where your brain in a vat, and that's enough to get an argument from ignorance going that seems to show that I don't know that I'm standing in my house right now. So that's one way in which the argument from ignorance seems to be a little bit stronger than the lottery paradox. It seems to threaten a bit more of our ordinary knowledge. Now notice, it is still true that a lot of our ordinary knowledge is threatened by the lottery paradox as well. So for instance, basically it looks like you'll be able to construct an argument that you're ignorant about any fact you might take yourself to know about the future. Pretty much any fact about the future is going to be susceptible to a lottery argument like this. So that's already one big aspect of what we might take to be our ordinary knowledge out the window. But it is true that there are some things, like things we might take to know about our immediate present and our immediate circumstances, that are not quite as susceptible to the lottery paradox. But on the other hand, it does seem like there's a certain way in which the lottery argument is maybe a better argument for skepticism. Why is that? Well, remember when we talked about the dreaming argument, we noticed that the dreaming argument seems to rely on a fairly strong view of knowledge. So we had to argue for the premise that we don't know that we're not brains and vats. And the argument seemed to rely on a very strong view of knowledge that said, whenever you can't rule out a possibility or something where P is false, then you can't know P. To be able to know P, you have to be able to rule out absolutely all the possibilities where it holds. And that is a certain weakness of the skeptical argument, because as we saw, you might just contest that view of knowledge. You might just say that's unrealistically demanding about what it takes to know something, and on that basis reject the argument. But that kind of response is not available when it comes to the lottery puzzle. Because the lottery puzzle didn't really seem to require very controversial assumptions about knowledge to get going. First of all, when you just consider the lottery propositions, it seems super intuitive that you don't know things like that. It seems really, really intuitive that you don't know that you're going to lose the lottery. I mean, one way to bring this out is, if you knew you were going to lose the lottery, why would you ever buy a ticket? It sort of seems like when you just even look at our ordinary behavior, it seems to confirm that we don't know lottery propositions. And that's a real difference with the original skeptical argument. You might think that our behavior with respect to heavyweight propositions does not suggest that we don't know these things. In fact, we act in ways that seem to take for granted that we're not brains and vats. But we don't seem to act in ways that take for granted lottery propositions. So, first of all, it just seems much more intuitive that we don't know lottery propositions. Second of all, while there is a sort of theoretical argument for the claim that we don't know lottery propositions, it's kind of simpler. And the main principle is just that if something is chancy, then you don't know it. Or put it another way, if there's a chance that you might win the lottery, then you don't know you're not going to win the lottery. And that seems like a really, really reasonable principle. That immediately sounds like something you want to say yes to. Like you want to say, that sounds like a really natural principle about knowledge. And it doesn't, on the face of it, it doesn't until you start thinking about lottery arguments, look like a principle like that is going to require that knowledge be very strong. But in fact, as we saw by looking at the lottery argument, it does. So that is a way in which the argument from lotteries is actually maybe a bit stronger than a skeptical argument. It might not have as much coverage, but it seems to rely on less controversial claims about what knowledge is like. First of all, it just seems really intuitive that we don't know lottery propositions. And second, the kind of principles that you'd need to motivate an argument that you don't know lottery propositions seem much less controversial. The principle that if something might happen, you don't know it won't, does not obviously commit you to a strong theory of knowledge in the way that the argument from dreaming seemed to. We've now seen that there is actually this widespread conflict between different kinds of judgments we have about knowledge claims. On the one hand, we ordinarily want to say that we know plenty of ordinary propositions. On the other hand, we seem very reluctant to say that we know lottery propositions. But in a lot of cases, the two are very closely related. In fact, the ordinary proposition will hold just in case the lottery proposition holds, and in fact we know this. This is exactly why we get the kind of tension that we looked at just a moment ago. So of course we've got to decide, well, what has to go? Something has to go, because we've got ourselves in a contradiction. But what? One thing that's very nice about Hawthorne's discussion is that he brings up some things that he thinks are constraints on any adequate solution. Some things he thinks that our theory of knowledge must respect in giving a theory of what's going on in lottery cases. The first thing he says is that he wants to take closure for granted. Closure is a premise of this argument just like it was a premise in the skeptical argument. But as you'll see in his discussion, he says, it looks like denying closure in the case for skepticism has not gone super well. So Nozick's theory of knowledge denies closure. We've already seen that there are lots of problems for that theory. Hawthorne makes a fairly detailed case that all of the attempts to bolster the view in a way that patches up the closure failures just generates more problems further down the road. So he thinks that denying closure is pretty implausible and it's not going to ultimately get us out of the puzzle. So he just suggests, let's just take closure for granted in our solution to this puzzle. The other three constraints he talks about are of a more intuitive nature rather than the theoretical nature of closure. And they're to do with assertion, practical reasoning, and chanciness. So first of all, with respect to assertion, he observes that it looks like when we assert things, we only do so if we take ourselves to know it. And one way to see that is just by looking at lottery cases. So for instance, take the proposition, I'm going to lose the lottery. That is often the kind of thing that you would not be willing to assert. Or at least not willing to assert merely based on the knowledge of your chances. So for instance, if I bought a lottery ticket and I just told you, oh, I'm going to lose the lottery, you could easily object by saying, well, you don't know that for sure. I mean, there's a chance that you'll lose. Putting it another way, suppose that the lottery has already happened and you're asking me the results of the lottery. It would be very misleading of me if I had no information beyond the chances to say, oh, I lost the lottery. Now, it's true, I know it's very, very likely that I lost the lottery, but I would be very unwilling in ordinary circumstances to just say that I lost. I'd be unwilling to assert that I lost without actually having gone and checked the results. What all this seems to indicate is that we only assert things, or we're only willing to assert things when we take ourselves to know them. So this is something Hawthorne thinks a theory of knowledge should respect. It should explain why are we only willing to assert things if we take ourselves to know them. The second point about practical reasoning is very similar. And the point is just that it seems like we only take propositions for granted, or we're only willing to take propositions for granted in our reasoning when we take ourselves to know them. A way to see this is again to focus on the lottery case and to notice that the following doesn't seem like a piece of good reasoning. So imagine you reasoned as followed. You think, well, here I have a lottery ticket that I've just bought. It's going to lose. The lottery ticket is a loser. So I should sell it for 1 cent to anybody who might offer me a cent for the ticket. Very few people would accept this kind of reasoning. Very few people who have just bought a lottery ticket would be immediately willing to sell the lottery ticket for 1 cent. But if you really did know that the ticket was going to lose, it looks like that wouldn't be a bad idea. If you know it's going to lose, why not sell it for 1 cent? You'll definitely be 1 cent better off. But as a matter of fact, we're not willing to go in for arguments like these. We're not willing to just give away the lottery ticket for 1 cent. And that seems to suggest that we only use in our practical reasoning propositions that we take ourselves to know. Because, as we saw, it looks like we don't take ourselves to know the lottery proposition. And that's exactly where this argument we just saw a moment ago seems to go wrong. If somebody tried to convince you to sell your ticket on the basis that it was going to lose, you would probably say, well, hang on, we don't know that. It may lose, it probably will lose, it's very, very likely it will lose, but it might win. And on that basis, the fact that it might win, it seems like we're unwilling to take for granted that the ticket is going to lose, and so complete the reasoning to the conclusion that we should sell it for 1 cent. The last constraint that he talks about, which again is sort of related to the two that we just mentioned, is that there's this connection, or apparent connection, between chance and knowledge. And the idea is that it just seems very intuitive that if you know something, saying that seems to be incompatible with saying that there's a chance that it might be false. So if I say there's a chance that I might win the lottery, there's like an X% chance that I'll win the lottery, that just seems to be in conflict with the claim that I know I'm not going to win. Put differently, it at least seems intuitive that you can't both know that you're going to lose even while there's a chance that you won. So these are the three things that Hawthorne thinks any solution to the lottery argument is going to have to respect. And it's exactly these things that he's going to use to evaluate a contextualist solution to the lottery.